From the APREL Bulletin, issue 82, September 2022.
Custodians of Tradition, or Creators, by Sister Mary Augustine OP. We're all more or less traditional by nature. We love trends. We start them, we follow them, and sometimes we cling to them long enough for them to become traditions. Some trends arise as simply preferences or customs confined to our own personal or local family life, and develop into cherished family traditions. But then there are those other traditions that extend themselves through larger dimensions of time and place. To whole societies they give shape and direction, and a sense of philosophical rootedness. Some traditions by their nature sweeten and build up. Others embitter and destroy. A society such as we presently experience in most parts of the world seems to be mostly operating tradition-free. It's running simply on trends, superficial fashions or ideas that come and go and leave us with a sense of emptiness, purposelessness, and, in the end, if they take an ideological turn, and many do, sheer dysfunctionality. It seems that our inbuilt human appreciation for creating and following genuine tradition, as distinct from these effervescent or ideological trends, is very much on the wane. So right now, to be tradition interested or tradition supportive is to be engaged in conflict. It's a conflict pitched between the extreme liberal and conservative or traditional sectors of society. The first, representing the position in the ascendancy, is committed to an endless push for trends marked by novelty and variety, and arising from warped and increasingly insane value systems. The second seems to be a kind of blind, inflexible adherence to what has been handed down, what has always been done. Of course, between these two extremes, we find many grades of either position, ranging from a basic common sense and practical wisdom to an attitude of sheer indolence and indifference. But the big battle is between the enthusiasts for the philosophies of traditionalism on the one hand and liberalism on the other, and nowhere is this more in evidence than in our own Catholic Church. Tradition in the Catholic scheme. The Catholic Church is big on tradition because it's a revealed religion. Tradition with a capital T, sacred tradition, is, along with sacred scripture, the revelation on which the Church is built, and by which it lives. So a Catholic has no option but to love, defend, and adhere in his life to the whole of Catholic tradition. Traditions in the Church, with small t's, are often beloved and formative elements in our Catholic life, but should not be confused with the essentials of the faith. The Catechism of the Catholic Church describes these as, quote, various theological, disciplinary, liturgical, or devotional traditions born in the local churches over time, adapted to different places and times, in which the great tradition is expressed, and which, in the light of tradition, with a capital T, can be retained, modified, or even abandoned under the guidance of the Church's magisterium. End of quote, from Catechism number 83. The arguments start and factions form when traditionally minded Catholics begin to assert their own right to declare something to be a Catholic tradition, decide what weighting it has as such, decide what, if any, modifications to it are in order as time goes on, decide when and if it should be terminated. Such decisions are valid enough when we're dealing with simple man-made family or social traditions. They're not okay when it comes to church-originated traditions. The Church alone has the prerogative of declaring what shall be passed down in her name. Features of tradition. There are few things about traditions that must necessarily be borne in mind, and often aren't, when engaging in discussions or exchanging acrimonies on the subject. To start with, we do well to remember that traditions have beginnings. They haven't always been there, although the traditionalists seem to imply otherwise, waxing eloquent about the age of some traditions, as though nothing of significance was there before them, and nothing of significance since. Then there's the question of the evolution of a tradition. By their very nature, traditions don't suddenly spring into existence. The practices involved often begin rather insignificantly and grow on us gradually until we begin to notice, then consciously treasure and actively promote them. A tradition doesn't evolve unmitigated or unmodified. Some of the value of a tradition is that it remains meaningful and applicable to human culture through many different eras. While human nature doesn't fundamentally change, human lifestyles, knowledge, and cultural understandings do. So, what seems perfectly compatible with life in one age may be simply anachronistic in another, and any customs or traditions which have not adapted, and need to, will either be cast aside as irrelevant or clung on to as interesting but archaeological remnants. Strange ideas of tradition. Right now, there are some strange ideas of tradition floating around. For some people, they've become the criteria as to what is to be taken as true and authentic in human life, and in particular, in human worship. They sound something like this. 1. The value of tradition lies in its age. It is old. The question is, how old? Is it a case of the older the better? 2. It is tried and tested. The question is, by whom, where, when, and under what conditions? 3. It is solidly founded. On what? By whom? For what purpose? 4. It is a precious heritage to be protected and perpetuated. But why? How? By whom? And for how long? Lefebvre and Tradition. St. John Paul II, in his strong but merciful motu proprio in 1988, Ecclesia Dei Adflicta, EDA, in which he clarifies the position of Archbishop Lefebvre, the bishops he had disobediently ordained, and his various adherents, priestly, lay and religious, quotes from Vatican II's Constitution Dei Verbum, in order to correct the incomplete and contradictory notion of sacred tradition, which lay at the root of Archbishop Lefebvre's schismatic act. Incomplete because it does not take sufficiently into account the living character of tradition, which, as the Second Vatican Council clearly taught, quote, comes from the apostles and progresses through the Church with the help of the Holy Spirit. There is growth in insight into the realities and words that are being passed on. This comes about in various ways. It comes through the contemplation and study of believers who ponder these things in their hearts. It comes from the intimate sense of spiritual realities which they experience. And it comes from the preaching of those who have received, along with their right of succession in the episcopate, the sure charism of truth. Dei Verbum number 8. End quote. The Pope continues, quote, but especially contradictory is a notion of tradition which opposed the universal magisterium of the Church possessed by the Bishop of Rome and the body of bishops. It is impossible to remain faithful to the tradition while breaking the ecclesial bond with him, and to whom, in the person of the Apostle Peter, Christ himself entrusted the ministry of unity in his Church. End of quote from EDA number 4. The position of Archbishop Lefebvre, in terms of seeing himself and his followers as embodying a kind of idealized tradition, involving a concept of tradition in isolation from the actual custodians and repositories of it, the Holy Father, the bishops in union with him, and the Vatican Council itself, is unfortunately being replicated on a widening scale in the Church today. It was happening before the motu proprio Traditionis custodes, but it's gained huge momentum since. It would seem then that it's possible to be too traditionalist to be faithful to tradition, to negate tradition itself in the process of promoting it. The faithful Catholic position. It's not faithful to Catholic tradition to decide for oneself who has the authority to legislate on what tradition is, what may be changed, what should be retained, and why. It's certainly not faithful to Catholic tradition to deny this prerogative to the Holy See, whoever the incumbent happens to be. It's not Catholic to deny the validity and truth of the teachings and directives of a Vatican Council, however badly distorted its various unofficial interpretations and implementations may turn out to be. It's not Catholic to deny the teaching authority of a pope who does not deliver tradition in the package most acceptable to one's own understanding of it. When tradition becomes ideology. The traditionalism forming up around the traditional Latin Mass, as it is falsely named, is showing signs of becoming an ideology. Back in the 1980s, when indults for offering the old form of Mass first emerged, attendees at the old form of the Mass, extraordinary form according to Pope Benedict, seemed to be simply voting with their feet, either because of negative experiences of the ordinary form, or because of a personal inclination towards traditional ideas and ways. Right now, however, the issue seems to have become ideological. It seemed to begin as a trend towards the old form of Mass, a kind of religious social fashion springing up among younger Catholics, by which they were attracted to choose this form for their Sunday worship, and to encourage their friends to do the same. That trend is now being openly called a movement, and judging by the utterances and strategies of many of its leaders and gurus, it certainly seems to have lost the appearance of a benignly natural evolution and become an ideologically driven one. There is much protestation right now that the intent of the Pope's motu proprio, Traditionis custodes, is misconceived in its stated intention to dampen down what is seen by the Holy Father and his men as an un-Catholic swing of old form Mass adherents against both Vatican II and the new form. The acknowledged tactic by the aggrieved sector is to convince the hierarchy, and especially the Pope, that traditional Mass Catholics are simple, humble, and faithful people with a sincere devotion to its form of the Mass, and a healthy desire to be formed and have their children formed in and by it. It's unfortunate that while this may be true for many of the tradition-loving Anawim, much of the enthusiasm such people are experiencing for the traditional Latin Mass has not come out of nowhere. There's a great deal of persuasive and impassioned rhetoric being poured out by certain Catholic media experts and demagogues, most of it arguing for the old form of Mass against the Mass of Vatican II, and at least some of it against Vatican II itself. There's also much bitter criticism of the Holy Father, of his decisions in Traditionis custodes, and much questioning of his authority to make such decisions and provisions. To many Catholics, especially the young, often patchily instructed in the faith, and largely uninstructed in matters liturgical, this propaganda can be captivating. People who want to be consciously full-on Catholics are being persuaded to abandon their Novus Ordo parishes with those bland, people-oriented, entertainment-type liturgies for the vibrant old-form communities where Mass is God-oriented, worshipful, and theologically watertight. And so an ideology is building around, of all things, the Mass. It's theologically fake and based largely on emotion. The number of times we hear the word feeling used in people's eloquent defences of the old form of Mass is somewhat alarming. Ideologies are built on emotion, as are the propaganda that feeds them. And even when the word tradition is bandied about in such ideological contexts, you can be sure that adherence to true tradition, as the Church defines it, will be in short supply. The article in this issue, in which we review the highly emotionally charged and propaganda-heavy movie Mass of the Ages, Episode 2, provides evidence for the kind of Mass formation going on in the Church at present. The massive popularity of this series testifies to the theological, liturgical, and historical ignorance under which most of us labour, and it highlights the great relevance of and need for Pope Francis's recent apostolic letter on the liturgy, Desiderio Desideravi.